This time on Her Service. On this episode, we travel back to the dawn of America to explore the stories of women whose yearning for service drove them to break through the societal walls and join the revolutionary struggle.
A lot of these women throughout the revolution, especially when the Declaration of Independence comes out, really think about, what do these words mean for me?
We'll introduce you to two extraordinary veterans. The American hero, Deborah Sampson.
She fights when she's about roughly in her 20s, but we don't really know what causes Deborah Sampson to go out and fight.
And the remarkable Brit, Hannah Snell.
Her husband actually leaves her, and Hannah Snell decides to disguise herself and join the Navy as a way so that she can try to find her husband.
Their paths were different, but their courage was undeniable. All that and more just ahead on Her Service, the Revolutionary War.
Across nearly 250 years of American history,
roughly 3 million women have answered the call to serve.
That's 3 million stories. 3 million acts of courage.
And 3 million lives that have shaped the fabric of our nation.
Yet, so often, their contributions remain whispers in the grand narrative of American military history.
From disguised soldiers fighting for independence in the Revolution,
to the daring pilots who soared through the skies in World War II,
and to the women standing on the front lines today.
Their presence has been essential.
Their impact undeniable.
This is not just a history lesson. This is a reclamation.
This is
Her Service.
We are here to amplify the voices that have been too long silenced.
To honor the resilience that has been too often overlooked.
And to acknowledge the sacrifices that have been too rarely recognized.
This podcast is dedicated to the women veterans, past, present, and future.
We're here to ensure their stories are never forgotten.
Join us as we delve into the extraordinary lives of these American heroes and discover the true, complete story of those who bravely served.
This is
Her Service.
Welcome to the DAV Podcast, Her Service. I'm Jonathan Kaupanger, and I'm just going to say this right up front. If you could see me right now, there'd be a massive neon sign above my head that says nerd with big arrows pointing down towards me. I'm a huge history nerd. I love telling stories, so I'm pretty much bouncing off the walls with excitement today. And when we started thinking about doing this podcast, we figured we should start from the beginning. So for us, that's the Revolutionary War. And to help us with our dive deep into the past is someone who makes it feel like yesterday. And honestly, she has the best job title ever. It makes me think of a combination of Disney World and Monet paintings. We're talking about the incredible Meg Bowersox, the manager of gallery interpretation at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. Meg's been with the museum since it opened in 2017. She has a master's degree in museum education and bachelor's of fine arts. Meg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So the Museum of the American Revolution, that's kind of right in the middle of everything there in Philadelphia, correct?
Yes, we are located in the heart of Old City, so we are just a few blocks away from places like Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell.
Awesome. What kind of exhibits do you have?
Well, right now we have our main exhibition is open, where we have about 13,000 square feet of exhibit space that talks a little about the ongoing revolution. So we talk about the Revolutionary War, which of course is the physical war itself. But we also extend this out to be a little bit before the revolution. So at kind of the end of the French and Indian War. And then at the end of the galleries, it branches to the Constitution, but even slightly encourages people to think even deeper past that and related to our own lives today.
And I was nosing through your website, and there is something I got to get up there to see myself. I'm assuming that it's a pretty popular thing, but you have George Washington's tent.
Oh, yes, we do. It is one of my personal favorite objects. That is in a theater in itself. And it is a 12-minute presentation about the history of the tent. So from George Washington acquiring it to how it was preserved over time, but it also discusses the everyday people who were with George Washington, who supported him in that headquarters and even preservation of that tent afterward. One of my favorites.
Yeah, sounds fun. Again, history nerd, so yes, it's going to sound fun to me.
We also have an exciting exhibition that opens on April 19th on the anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We'll be having about 15 different Revolutionary War flags on display for the first time all together in a very long time, which will be very exciting as well.
Awesome. So before we get into our two main people that we're going to talk about, can you describe what life was like in general for women during the American Revolution?
Yeah, it's very interesting when we think about history and we think about the past, we kind of create these narratives in our mind about, particularly women staying at home, just doing needlework, not really playing active roles. But during the revolution, women actually took on some very unconventional roles, which we're going to talk about a little bit. But traditionally, they are assigned to domestic duties, so taking care of the house, getting married, having children. And a lot of their time and attention and their education was focused on that. However, a lot of these women throughout the revolution, especially when the Declaration of Independence comes out, really think about, what do these words mean for me and, my freedoms and my rights? One of the things that I'll talk about a little bit too, if you're interested in, is, English common law, which is something that we're going to be following, right? Because we're colonists, part of British rule, before we really start this revolution. And that really barred, once women got married, to having economic freedom. So English law essentially was, once a woman married a man, that property that was once hers now is all assumed to be her husband's property. So, for example, let's say a woman was given a house when her father died, for example, right? And then this woman gets married. Well, now that house no longer is a part of her name, but a part of her husband's property. So really, honestly, to be single or to be widowed would have given more rights to women in terms of economic freedom.
Wasn't that something called chattel, I think?
Coverture.
Okay. What were some of the ways that the women did serve in the war?
Yeah, so one of the things that they did, Esther DeBert Reed, who is someone that we feature in our galleries, actually is someone who's a local Philadelphian, and she actually starts a fundraising campaign for the Continental Army. So one of the things she does is she raises along with other women in Philadelphia, roughly $300,000 for the soldiers and for the Army itself.
So $300,000 back then?
Yes. Or what that would equate to, I think, in today's world is like 300,000.
Okay.
Math in the 18th century is hard. I'm not a mathematician. Don't ask me to know.
I'm a word person, so I get it.
So she writes to George Washington and is like, hey, we did this. She wrote this proclamation called the Sentiments of an American Woman, which kind of calls to action these ladies to take an active role in this politics. And she writes to George Washington like, hey, man, I have all this money. She doesn't say, hey, man, that's me. She's like, hey, I have all this money. Like, I would love to figure out a way that we can donate this, or give it to the soldiers. What's the best way? And George Washington replies, rather than just giving them the money, to actually spend it on textiles to make shirts for the Continental Army. So one of the things, supplies were fairly low during the start of the revolution. The United States is in its very, trying to be a part of something, right? Trying to become its own country. So there's not a lot of money. So to be able to make shirts for the Army, that's one thing that they wouldn't have to worry about. So they end up creating the Ladies Association, which was a group of various women who actually sewed shirts for the Army.
It almost sounds like there was like a minor feminist revolution going on at the same time.
Yeah, you could say that. Abigail Adams, one of the people that we most well known, she has one of the biggest three words, remember the ladies. And she is someone who is arguing for, she argues for Native American rights, African American rights at some points as well, too. But in her one particular letter in March of 76, when she knows that Congress is going to be talking about declaring independence, she basically tells John Adams to remember the ladies when you're creating these new code of laws, because if you don't, we're just going to foment a rebellion. But it's this idea of people, this Enlightenment period, this sharing of ideas, and people are hearing these words and hearing what people are saying and wondering, how does that apply to me? And that also was enslaved people, at that same time as well, too.
Deborah Sampson and Hannah Snell. Now, our listeners may be familiar with Sampson because of the Deborah Sampson Act. Are you familiar with that?
I actually am not.
Okay, so this is recently, it was something, and our organization helped back it.
Cool.
It set up better care for women at the VA, and it set up the Special Office for Women's Health. It boosts services for things like transitioning into civilian life, finding housing, and dealing with trauma. These two veterans, they're super similar, but they're also very different at the same time. Can you tell us about them?
So while both of them served, one of them actually served as a part of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, right? That's Deborah Sampson, served in the Army, so as a soldier. And in juxtaposition with Hannah Snell actually serves prior to the Revolutionary War on the British side in the Navy, actually, so as a sailor. So there's two different roles right there. I think for both of them, they are similar in the fact that they continue to serve through their injuries. So they both withstand injuries, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point a little bit later on. But how they go about their choices of serving is a little different. And their backgrounds of how they get into that service is different. So for Deborah Sampson, when she's about 5 years old, her father leaves the family and they're very poor. So the mother decides to split up the children. She had definitely had siblings and decides to split up the children amongst other parts of the family. The family that Deborah was a part of could not take care of her after a certain point of time. So decided to put her into indentured servitude at a young age until she was about roughly 18 years old. This indentured servitude, basically you are paid, you are given food, you're given clothing, and essentially you're working, for that, which was a common role that women actually did have, in the revolution in general as a job or as, part of that servant. And so she fights when she's about roughly in her 20s. So there's about a 2-year period where she's a teacher and she ends up a weaver, but we don't really know what causes Deborah Sampson to go out and fight. Is it those revolutionary ideas? Is it because, you have just been released from your servitude and now you have barely any money, you have no family, no connections. So is the army your one way to support yourself, which even for a lot of male soldiers, they took up that as a way to survive essentially and to get their stature in life. And then with Hannah Snell's husband, I guess similarly, her husband actually leaves her, and Hannah Snell decides to disguise herself and join the Navy as a way so that she can try to find her husband. He was a sailor of some kind. I don't know if he was in the military or not, to be perfectly honest. But I do know that he was in some type of the mariner field.
Okay.
And then she enlists and decides to fight using her brother-in-law's name, James Gray. So they're both, I think, what happened to them socially kind of put them in their positions to want to fight. So they're very similar in that regard, but the choices as to why they fight are different.
What's the motivation for dressing like a man?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, you could not fight as a woman in the 18th century. That's plain and simple. You could not, that was not allowed, essentially. There are extraordinary cases where women are fighting, especially in the Revolution. So I'm sure you're familiar with Molly Pitcher.
Yep.
Molly Pitcher is actually based off of a woman at the Battle of Monmouth who took the place of her husband at the cannon. And that follows a similar story to another woman named Margaret Corbin, who's at the Battle of Fort Washington. And both of these women are camp followers, which was another way that you could have supported the army, which is by being a wife or sometimes the mother or those children of those soldiers. They're also following, doing things like laundry, taking care of stuff. And so their husbands are both operating cannons. At these two separate battles, their husbands essentially get wounded and both of them die essentially from their wounds. And both of these women go up and take the place of their husbands in that fire line, essentially because you need a certain amount of people in order to operate a cannon. Both of these women, end up serving, and they're in their regular clothing. Joseph Plum Martin, who writes a memoir of his story, actually talks about the woman at the Battle of Monmouth. He doesn't name her because he wouldn't have known her at the time. Mm-hmm. But he actually notes that she was manning the cannon and a cannonball actually goes underneath her petticoat, and makes this comment about, it's lucky that it didn't hit her higher or something like that in that regard. It's interesting when we think about that. And, honestly, I looked this up and I didn't realize that it really wasn't until 1948 until women were formally allowed to really serve.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. That's crazy.
Isn't it?
I didn't realize that at all. And I think for them, it's And Deborah Sampson, we have a book exactly. She dresses up and she goes and enlists in her town. And Abner Weston, whose diary we have, basically is like writes the story about how she comes and they find her out and they don't let her enlist because they know that she's Deborah. So she ends up having to go out. She goes I think 200 or so miles outside of her local area in order to enlist. And that's why she's successful the second time, because they don't recognize her.
Okay, well, let's talk about their disguises. I don't think it was Hannah Snell, now that I'm thinking about it, but in my research, I did find, because there was several women who did this. There was another woman who got flogged.
Yep.
And, so they ripped the back of the shirt. How do they keep their disguises?
Yeah, what we know about this, so it's interesting. It's the same thing about menstrual cycles. Nobody writes these things down, right? In the past, right? Those things were kept secret. But what we know, or what historians can gather from reading both the reviews of Hannah Snell and of Deborah Sampson, when they're written about in their time periods, is that they're described as having male features, like more male features. Also, artists have their own license and depictions, right, which also depict them a certain type of way. But because of their ages, because they're both fairly young, they can pass for a younger man. They wouldn't have to shave, It's interesting because in Hannah Snell's story, some of the crew that she is with ends up actually calling her Miss Molly Gray. And it's interesting. And they're calling James Hannah that because they don't shave,
Yeah.
They haven't seen him shave.
Didn't she have to start flirting with some woman in town or something?
And she had to start flirting with somebody. Deborah Sampson also, that is also something that I think is spoken about in the book about Deborah Sampson as well, too. And at this point in time, there's a lot of stress when you're on camp, and thinking about menstrual cycles, is another thing, like how you hide that.
Yeah.
And in the 18th century, they're under so much stress. They're malnourished. These soldiers and people aren't getting their supplies. So that is probably off, but also they might have just assumed that it was some type of a disease or something if another soldier had seen that. I know that there was one woman who was found out, who actually is featured in our When Women Lost the Vote exhibit, our special exhibition that we had in 2020, where we don't even know who this woman's name was, but she was found out for disguising herself as a man in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. And they write about how they humiliated her essentially for fighting. And they actually marched her out to the beat of what is called the Whore's March, to put her basically on parade for enlisting, which is interesting. And then you have people like Deborah Sampson, right, who gets an honorable discharge for their service. So I think it really depends on where you are, who your captain is, what's happening at the time, what time period it is. And I think all of that really has to go into, especially in the 18th century, a lot of, it's like an onion. It has a lot of layers, I think.
Yeah. It's all who you know. It's always been that way. It always will be that way. What kind of challenges did they face while they were serving as soldiers?
Yeah, I mean, they face the same things that soldiers face today, death, injury, being captured, moving those, but also being found out, I think, so for both Deborah and Hannah in their stories that are told about them after their service, they're both noted as having injuries. And to have an injury, you should go to a doctor or get someone to figure that out, right? But you don't want to be found out, so you're not going to go to a doctor. With both of them, I think, and one of them, I think it's Deborah, talks about actually taking the bullet out herself.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know if Hannah's account has that. It's been a minute since I've read that one. But, to keep those wounds kind of hidden, that's, I think, one of the reasons why, I know Hannah actually goes into the hospital, I think a couple times because of her injury. But it's interesting to see how they chose to not go to the doctor essentially so that they weren't found out, which is interesting.
And I guess technically Deborah Sampson, because we are disabled American veterans, Deborah Sampson was one of the first official disabled veterans, female veterans.
Yeah, absolutely. And so was Margaret Corbin. Margaret Corbin also actually, I think, doesn't receive a discharge for her service, but I think what she gets is a veteran's pension later on, because she also sustains, like Deborah, basically wounds that make her, incapacitated to be able to do things. But it's, yeah. So, and Deborah actually ends up like, I was just rereading, I just was able to find her husband's application for a pension when Deborah dies. And in his pension, when he's talking about, asking for the pension, the widower's pension, he writes that for about 20 years, he is the one who's paying for her health to make sure she's okay, because that's how, I think bad at the end of her life it was from her injuries.
Mm. But did she get the pension while she was still alive?
Yes. So she receives an honorable discharge, when she ends up being found out. She applies for a pension at first and is denied it. And that's, I think, in like the early 1800s. And then she reapplies later on and she does receive a pension. But she ends up, what she's trying to do is essentially what I've gathered is trying to get the payment that she was supposed to receive from the army, for her service.
Oh, so she didn't get paid for the...
Well, soldiers' pensions, it's almost like any soldier. Some of them would get an initial payment, right, for your service. But then at the end of the war, there's a continental currency has not a lot of value. There's a lot of strain. And so what they're giving a lot of soldiers in some cases is IOUs, or like almost like an IOU is a bad term, but almost like you can come claim this when we've got our federal government, essentially. Like this kind of happens a little bit later when Hamilton comes into play and Secretary of the Treasury. They do establish a way to pay soldiers, but they don't have it quite yet because they haven't won the war. So they have to figure out how they're going to pay people. So this is one of the things that is seen as payment. So a lot of these soldiers, when they get it, will then go to whoever it is to use this piece of paper to buy a house or the land or et cetera to get what they want, which is interesting.
And wasn't it illegal, or I don't know if illegal is the right word, but women could not be paid for services during the Revolution. Is that true?
What do you mean?
Like they couldn't be paid for, one of my, a favorite story of mine is Mrs. David Wright's Guard.
Okay,
and
yeah.
The town actually ended up paying these people. They were a militia of just women. Mm-hmm. And the town actually ended up paying these people, but they then minutes of the town meeting had to call them a man's name because they couldn't pay them as women. So they were called a man's name. Leonard Whiting's Guard is what the town meeting is called, because you can't put a woman's name in there and have them get money.
Yeah, there's something, it's all that coverture thing, a lot of that is wrapped up in the English common law. And I think as you start to see this country develop later on, that's when more systems get into place. But, women are owning businesses. They are working, in other capacities. So women are getting paid. I think it just depends probably on whatever circumstance or whatever is happening and what laws are in charge. It's hard because there's not, I think people think that there's like a regimented system in the 18th century, and there still really isn't.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania has its own money. Virginia has its own money. It's so vast and large for us, I think, to try and understand how, it's interesting.
So just to kind of wrap things up nicely, which this is going to be a horrible question to do this, but what do the stories of Hannah and Deborah tell us about the limitations and possibilities of women in the 18th century?
The revolution is inspiring, and I think for these stories, it really challenged the gender norms. And it really allowed for people to think about what is happening, the Declaration of Independence. What do these ideals and these laws mean, and how do they apply to me? And because it was such a revolutionary moment, people were able to take that ability and change it, and make those laws and question those laws and be able to produce something that's going to happen later, which I think is really cool. So I think it's really just about, even when you feel like things are not going your way, you can still find a way to find that light. And there's still a way to somehow get through it and to revolve and to change. And, it only takes one person to be able to change the world.
Yep. That's very, very cool. Thank you so much, Meg.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I can't tell you that enough. Thank you so much for being on the first podcast about America's women veterans. Now, before we go, and I know that's a lot of information, but I have two more women to quickly tell you about. Honorable mentions, if you will. Now, even though women most often weren't officially in the military, history has plenty of examples of women who helped the revolution. But the problem is, it's hard to sort out what's real and what's propaganda or just a tall tale. But the stories are super fun and at least partially true. The first one, Nancy Morgan Hart, reminds me of my grandmother. Really in just kind of the fact that you could mess with Nancy Morgan Hart once, but only once. She was an expert herbalist, a very good hunter, and a great shot. My favorite story of Ms. Hart takes place in 1779. A group of British soldiers stopped by her cabin looking for either to arrest somebody or to get a meal. Now, she invited them in for a meal and gave them plenty of booze while they ate. She then snuck all their guns away using a hole in the wall. And after that, using their last weapon, she held them at gunpoint and sent one of her kids into town for help. Of course, 2 of the soldiers tried to escape, but she killed them both. Now, there are several versions of the story and a lot more to it. But she's a very, very interesting person. And some even think that she could be Agent 355 from Washington's Culper spy ring. Who knows? Agent 355 was such a good spy, we really don't know who she was, but we know she was good at her job. She's responsible for exposing Benedict Arnold, so we like her. We like her a lot. And finally, and really one of my favorites, is Patience Lovell Wright. She was the first American-born sculptor, and she worked in wax. And you can today find a full-length piece of her work in Westminster Abbey in London. But that's not what makes her interesting. Supposedly, she was a spy for America. And in 1771, she moved to England and was introduced to King George III and Queen Charlotte. Again, supposedly, she scandalized society because she used their first names. Now, the story goes that she used her association with the king and queen to get information and then would pass it along through Ben Franklin. But the best part about her is that Abigail Adams called her the Queen of Sluts. And I'm just going to leave that right there for you. I hope this gives you a little more motivation to dig deeper into the lives of these incredible women, maybe seek out their stories and share what you've learned. The bottom line is, these are veterans and their contributions deserve to be recognized and celebrated. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. I'm Jonathan Kaupanger, and this is Her Service.